Much has been said about the Nuremberg trials against the leaders of the National Socialist regime, but not so much about the Tokyo trials against the leaders of the Japanese Empire, one of the Axis powers allied with Germany and Italy in World War II. Today we are going to learn about the history of this little-known episode, which is not without controversy and hidden lies. This is Reynaldo Carrillo Vilches speaking, and don't miss this special edition of La Nueva Enciclopedia. Thank you. Before talking about the Tokyo trials, we need to briefly review the situation in Japan before September 2, 1945, when Japan signed its surrender to the American General Douglas MacArthur. Long before World War II, Japan, under a nationalist doctrine that positioned the island nation as a true empire stretching across East Asia, had been pursuing an expansionist campaign with which, between 1875 and 1939, they came to control a long list of important territories. Among these were the Kuril Islands, the Korean Peninsula, the Kwantung Peninsula, the island of Taiwan, more than 600 islands of Micronesia, the strategic region of Manchuria in China, and the Chinese cities of Beijing, Nanking, and Shanghai. This, of course, caused concern among Western powers such as the United States, England, and France, who, after having been allies of Japan, gradually distanced themselves and imposed blockades and economic sanctions to stop its advance. When World War II began in Europe in 1939, Emperor Hirohito accelerated this Japanese expansionist campaign, and in 1940 the conquest of French Indochina was launched. And after the attack on the American base at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, they took control of the island of Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong. This triggered the declaration of war on Japan by the United States that same month and the entry of both nations into the global conflict. By mid-1942, Japan had already conquered practically all of the Asian Pacific, as it controlled the Philippines, the British colonies of Malaya and Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and the northern part of New Guinea. In these territories, several documented excesses and crimes would take place, such as mass executions, torture, concentration and forced labor camps, rape of women, and many others. Violent practices that were carried out by all sides in this bloody war. And the excesses of the Imperial Japanese Army gave people plenty to talk about, as we will see later on. And it is mainly around these events that the so-called Tokyo trials will revolve. Going back to 1943 with the Battle of Midway and the intensification of American operations in Asia, commanded by General Douglas MacArthur, the Japanese will start being defeated, and the empire of the rising sun will fall piece by piece. By early August 1945, the war, which had already ended in Europe, was still just as fierce in Asia. With a weakened Japan, but with an old samurai tradition fervently willing to fight to the last man, two events occur that will mark Japan's final defeat. On one hand, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and on the other, the massive conquest and invasion of Manchuria by the Soviet Union, which was under Japanese control. They triggered Japan's decision to surrender at the beginning of August 1945. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito broadcasts a radio message proclaiming Japan's surrender, and on August 30, General MacArthur arrives in Japan so that the act of surrender can be signed on September 2. This leads to the establishment of a new body called the Supreme Command for the Allied Powers, presided over by MacArthur himself, to carry out the so-called American occupation of Japan, a military occupation that would last for 7 years. And it would clearly be a restructuring of the Japanese nation to adapt it to the new global order led by the United States. After the Japanese defeat, some conditions were imposed, such as the disarmament of the Japanese army, the prohibition of teaching nationalist ideals in schools, the selective purge of the public administration, and the dismantling of the Japanese military industry. Thus, on February 15, MacArthur establishes the Tribunal, And in parallel to all this, on January 19, 1946, General MacArthur issues the Special Proclamation, where he announces the establishment of the so-called International Military Tribunal for the Far East to carry out, I quote, the prompt trial and punishment of the main war criminals of Japan, according to his words. On February 15, MacArthur thus establishes the so-called International Military Tribunal for the Far East. Unlike Nuremberg, where there were only 4 judges, in Tokyo 11 judges were summoned, one for each country that Japan invaded or attacked. These were, respectively, Australia, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, France, the Netherlands, New Zealand, India, and the Philippines. Beyond this, as is documented in practice, it would be MacArthur in the United States who would have the most influence during the judicial process, being able, as we will see later, to alter or reduce sentences. Later, on Emperor Hirohito's birthday, the tribunal presents the formal indictment against 28 Japanese leaders, accusing them of perpetrating the so-called crimes against peace. Thus, on May 3, 1946, in a place that was used to symbolically assert American dominance over surrendered Japan. In the former headquarters of the dissolved Ministry of War in Tokyo, the Allied powers begin the so-called Tokyo trials against several of the main leaders of the former powerful Japanese Empire. An important historical peculiarity of the Tokyo trials is that even before they began, they already had their first and only acquitted person, none other than Emperor Hirohito. At that time, the Emperor of Japan was not mainly a symbolic figure, as he is today, but was at the same time a living deity, a descendant of the sun, according to Japanese mythology. In addition to being the highest head of state in Japan, he also held great sociological and political importance. During the war, it was Hirohito who devised, planned, and executed most of Japan's political and military decisions, a conflict in which his participation was more than evident. However, precisely because of his importance, MacArthur, who was de facto in command in Japan, gave the order not to prosecute Hirohito or his family, out of fear of a civil uprising that would make the occupation more difficult, and because he thought it would be in the best interest of the United States to handle it differently. But as for the rest, most of the members of the Japanese General Staff and the Ministerial Cabinet would be prosecuted in these trials, leaving Hirohito with no choice but, to the disappointment of many Japanese people, to watch these trials unfold helplessly, and to see, as the years went by, the gradual disappearance of his power as emperor. Now then, for the Tokyo trials, the so-called Tokyo Charter was created, which defined 2 important points. The first would be the methodology of the trials, which would be an adversarial system based on the American model, where the prosecution, representing the affected states, and the defense of the Japanese defendants present the evidence, the statements, and the arguments before the judges. Secondly, the categories of crimes are defined. The first will be the Class A crimes, also called crimes against peace, which consisted of the planning, preparation, initiation, or execution of a war of aggression, that is, a war initiated without justification. It's worth noting that, according to many jurists of the time, the so-called war of aggression was not a legally defined crime before this conflict began, accusing the tribunal of applying retroactive laws to prosecute as many people as possible. Then there were the Class B crimes, also known as conventional war crimes. This category focused on direct violations of the laws and customs of war established in previous international treaties, such as the Geneva and Hague Conventions. They were, above all, people accused of ordering or carrying out actions such as unjustified mistreatment, torture or executions of prisoners of war, looting of public or private property, unjustified destruction of cities or towns, and the use of chemical or biological weapons. And finally, there were the Class C crimes, also known as crimes against humanity. This category was introduced to address systematic excesses committed against civilian populations, including acts such as slavery, forced labor, deportation, and persecution carried out by the Japanese in territories conquered by Japan. With this in mind, let's take a look at who were the main figures among the 28 defendants in the Tokyo trials. Let's start with those who were charged with all three types of crimes described earlier at the same time. The first one who stands out is Jiraiya Toyo, the Prime Minister of Japan, Minister of War, and second in command to Hirohito until July 1944. Toyo is mainly charged in these crime categories for conspiracy and directing the commission of war crimes. Next is Seishiro Itagaki, Minister of War until 1939 and a prominent military figure during the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Itagaki is charged with all three types of crimes, especially for the inhumane treatment of prisoners of war in Southeast Asia. In addition to this, there will also be Kenji Doihara, a long-serving military officer in Japan with significant involvement in political and military intelligence operations. He is accused because of his involvement in the invasion and occupation of Manchuria from 1937 to 1945. Shigetaro Shimada, Minister of the Navy, was especially accused of all three types of crimes by the United States for his involvement in the attack on Pearl Harbor, which Shimada described as justified. In response to the economic blockade that North America had imposed on Japan on the eve of the war, in turn, the Vice Minister of War, Hitaro Kimura, nicknamed by the Allies as the Butcher of Myanmar, is accused of all three types of crimes for atrocities committed in Southeast Asia, such as the notorious case of the Death Railway, a 415-kilometer railroad built by 16,000 prisoners of war and 100,000 civilians who suffered completely inhuman conditions, as well as diseases and a form of slavery. As for the Japanese occupation of China, there are also many defendants, such as Marshal Shunro Kuhata and the Chief of Staff, Umesu Yoshihiro. On the other hand, a large number of the defendants were only charged with Class A crimes. Among them, Sadao Araki stands out, who was an army general and promoter of the Kodosha, which was the army's political faction that staunchly defended Japanese expansionism and nationalism. Japanese expansionism and nationalism. He was accused, among other things, of spreading ideas considered to be very radical. Shigenori Togo also stands out, Minister of Foreign Affairs, who between 1941 and 1942 was accused of facilitating Japan's tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. Similar to the case of Hiroshi Oshima, the Japanese ambassador in Berlin, who was accused of promoting the alliance with Hitler. Okinari Kaya, Minister of Finance, is also accused of mobilizing economic resources in favor of the Japanese military apparatus. Similar to the case of Naoki Hoshino, Secretary of the Ministerial Cabinet, who was accused of collaborating with the economic planning of the empire's expansionist campaign. As we can see, among the accused, there were not only military personnel, but also officials from the Japanese public administration. Let's see how these controversial Tokyo trials unfold. Although nominally the 11 countries that made up the panel of judges had equal powers, in practice it was the United States that took the lead, backed by the strong character of MacArthur and the effective military control of the island. Proof of this is that the prosecution, that is, the representatives of the affected nations, was headed by the American lawyer Joseph Kinnan, who was appointed directly by President Harry Truman for this purpose. Although the other 10 countries sent assistant prosecutors, it was Kinnan who would have strategic control of this case. For their part, the defendants had double representation, Japanese lawyers and American assistant lawyers, so that according to them, due process would be guaranteed. The court sessions are held in both English and Japanese and are individual, meaning that each defendant will be tried separately and the sentence will be applied individually. Although it is worth noting, there were several Japanese defendants who appeared as witnesses in the sessions of other Japanese defendants. With the sessions thus beginning on May 3, 1946, the first phase of the trial, is the prosecution's case. Between June of that year and January of 1947, this stage takes place in which a large amount of evidence about the committed excesses is presented. Evidence from Manchuria and testimonies about the Nanking Massacre, where between 100,000 and 300,000 Chinese prisoners of war and civilians died due to the Japanese siege of the city, are presented, along with other cases such as the well-known case of the previously mentioned death railway. Now, although the prosecution, controlled by the United States, skillfully and truthfully presents several of the facts recently described, it also, according to several historians, carries out a systematic manipulation of the evidence. The greatest proof of this is the cover-up by the prosecution of the Unit 731 case, a place where a large number of human experiments were carried out on prisoners of war. MacArthur orders the evidence of these crimes to be hidden and grants immunity to the Japanese scientists. In exchange for them now working for the U.S. Army and handing over all the information and results, in return for pardoning their sentences, ensuring that these horrific events were barely mentioned during the trials. The second phase of the trial is the defense. Between February 1947 and December 1947, a stage in which the 28 defendants, to a greater or lesser extent, start from the same premise. The war, contrary to what the prosecution and the jury thought, was justified, since Japan in the years leading up to the war had suffered an economic blockade, trade and military embargoes, and the freezing of assets by the powers, which in their view constituted serious acts of aggression against the nation that justified a military response. Another argument of the defendants is that Class A crimes committed by the so-called war of aggression, were a type of offense created exclusively to judge the Japanese and which was not provided for in any international treaty prior to these events. The defendants claimed that war was an equally valid instrument for all nations to exercise sovereignty, and not a crime for which individuals should be imprisoned. They try to present evidence of atrocities and excesses also committed by the Allied powers during the war, crimes and atrocities against civilians and Japanese soldiers, as evidence that there were no victims and perpetrators here, but rather two sides that were at war. However, all these arguments are systematically dismissed by the jury, who consider them irrelevant. In this sense, the accused, from the member of the general staff to the ministers, choose to declare that they were simply following the emperor's orders. Hirohito, the very same person who, although he was the most important figure in these trials, was acquitted. Meanwhile, some Japanese diplomats and civilians stated that from their position, they had no knowledge of what was happening on the war fronts. In this legal scenario, with an abundance of evidence of what the U.S. prosecution considered crimes, and with a defense for the accused that was completely dismissed by the judges, it was easy for the Allied tribunal to prepare its verdict. Even so, there were still some doubts among the jury itself about the legality of these trials. One of the most prominent voices came from the Indian judge, Radhavinod Pal. Judge Pal wrote a 700-page document questioning the very tribunal to which he belonged. He stated that the Western powers, such as the United Kingdom and France, had neither the legal nor moral authority to judge Japanese imperialism, when these same nations continued to maintain colonies in Asia and Africa, and had been practicing this same imperialism for over a century. So Pal is going to vote for the acquittal of all the defendants. Another dissenting voice was the Dutch judge Bert Rolling, who argued that Class A crimes, known as crimes against peace, were not well defined legally, and that the death penalty was excessive. And others, like the French judge Henry Bernard and the Australian William Webb, criticized the American decision to acquit Hirohito, and that by doing so, the death sentences of the emperor's subordinates should be changed to life imprisonment. This, however, would not prevent the tribunal from making its decision based on the criteria of the United States. After the defense phase ended between January 1948 and November 1948, the jury began its deliberation. 4,336 documents of evidence, 419 testimonies, and 779 sworn statements are analyzed throughout the year by the tribunal. The final sentence, specifying the penalty to be applied to each of the accused, is formally read on November 4th. Of the 28, accused Prime Minister Hideki Toyo and a large part of the ministerial cabinet and the high military command, like Seishiro Itagaki, Kenji Dojira, Matsui Iwane, Kimura Hitaro, Akira Muto, and Hirohito Takoki, all of them are executed on November 23, 1948. In Sugamo prison by hanging, literally bringing a definitive end to the high command of the former Japanese Empire. Meanwhile, another 16 defendants are sentenced to life imprisonment, although in the end, except for one who died in prison, all of them would be released. Between 1952 and 1955, between 3 and 6 years after the sentence, in what historians have called the reverse course, since after the U.S. occupation of Japan ended in 1952, and with the start of the Cold War, the United States began to see Japan more as an ally than as an enemy. It is in this context that the United States gave Japan permission to release prisoners sentenced to life imprisonment, since many of them had been and were fervently anti-communist. Furthermore, it is worth noting that the release of the prisoners was a genuine request from the Japanese people, who collected millions of signatures for this purpose. So, out of the original 28 accused, only 3 were not prosecuted. Yosuke Matsuoka, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, died of tuberculosis during the trial. Osami Nagano, Fleet Admiral, died of pneumonia, and Shumei Okawa was declared mentally unfit to stand trial and died in a psychiatric hospital in 1957. In this way, the Tokyo trials constitute an unusual episode in world history and international law, as well as a unique process in global and geopolitical conflicts. It reflects the many faces and facets of what is called the application of justice and the assertion of the victor's criteria over the written law at the time of its application. Thank you all very much for watching this video. I remind you that your support means a lot to us. By leaving your comments, giving us a like, subscribing to the channel, sharing the video with all your friends, and clicking the bell to activate notifications. Nagano, the Fleet Admiral, dies of pneumonia, and Shumei is declared mentally unfit to stand trial.